There is a pattern woven through the rise and fall of nations. A pattern so subtle and so slow that most people fail to see it until the consequences are irreversible. And it once shattered the world's second-largest economy without a single shot fired or a single revolution announced, because the kind of destruction it brings is quieter than war, deeper than corruption, and more permanent than political collapse. And this pattern is built not on dramatic events, but on the silent arithmetic of demography, the relentless accumulation of debt, and the passage of time that no country can bargain with, no matter how powerful it believes itself to be. And Japan, a nation once considered unstoppable, became the first modern example of how a great power can fade not through catastrophe, but through mathematics that slowly reshapes the destiny of an entire society. For decades, Japan was the miracle of the post-war world, rising from devastation to global dominance in less than a generation, building industries that terrified competitors, setting standards of efficiency that reshaped manufacturing worldwide, and inspiring politicians, economists, and CEOs who believed Japan had discovered a new model for permanent prosperity. And during the 1980s, the fear of Japan in the United States was real and widespread, as newspapers warned of a future where American companies would be outmatched, American cities bought up, and American influence overshadowed by a disciplined, unstoppable, technologically superior Japanese juggernaut. Tokyo real estate reached mythical valuations. Corporate empires expanded outward with unstoppable momentum, and Japanese investors purchased landmarks like Rockefeller Center not as trophies, but as routine business investments in a world they believed they were destined to lead. And the narrative of the time painted Japan not as a competitor, but as the next global center of gravity. But beneath the surface of this miracle economy, the seeds of decline were already planted, because demography does not ask permission to shape the future. And while the world admired Japan's discipline and productivity, the country's population structure was collapsing in slow motion. With birth rates falling below replacement level, marriage rates declining, families shrinking, and the nation aging faster than any country had aged in recorded human history. And this demographic transformation was not a temporary dip or a cyclical fluctuation, but a structural shift that no government policy could reverse quickly enough. Fewer children meant fewer future workers, fewer taxpayers, fewer innovators, fewer consumers, and fewer young families to sustain the cultural and economic dynamism that had fueled Japan's rise. And as the working-age population shrank, the weight of supporting an expanding elderly population grew heavier each year, forcing the country to rely increasingly on debt, monetary intervention, and artificial stimulus to maintain a standard of living that no longer reflected its underlying demographics. Japan's stock market and real estate bubbles of the 1980s were not signs of unstoppable growth, but the early warning signals of an economy attempting to outrun demographic gravity. And when the bubbles burst, the country did not launch into a crisis that could be fixed with a few years of reform. Instead, it entered a long, flat, stagnant period, now known as the Lost Decades, in which growth nearly vanished, wages stagnated, productivity gains slowed, and an entire generation grew up in an economy that had forgotten what real expansion felt like. Japan's national debt spiraled upward year after year, eventually surpassing 260% of GDP, the highest in the developed world, not because of reckless spending, but because of demographic math. As fewer workers supported more retirees, more pensions, more healthcare costs, and more long-term obligations that could no longer be funded by the shrinking tax base. And the government resorted to near-zero interest rates, endless quantitative easing, and massive bond purchases to keep the financial system stable, turning the Bank of Japan into both financier and emergency life support for the entire economy. Japan did not collapse in violence or despair. It simply faded, becoming a quiet, aging, stable, stagnant society that preserved wealth but no longer generated momentum. And while this soft decline seemed preferable to the chaos faced by other nations, it also served as a silent warning that even the wealthiest, most technologically advanced societies can lose the ability to grow when the demographic foundation erodes beneath them. Now shift the lens to the United States, a nation far larger, far younger historically, and far more influential globally, but one that is experiencing the early stages of the same demographic transformation that reshaped Japan's future. Because 10,000 baby boomers retire every single day, creating the largest retirement wave in human history, and by 2030, older Americans will outnumber children for the first time, marking a demographic milestone with profound economic consequences. The U.S. fertility rate has dropped below replacement, a shift once believed impossible in a country defined by immigration, growth, and cultural dynamism. And although America still benefits from immigration more than Japan ever did, immigration alone cannot fully counteract the combination of falling birth rates, rising life expectancy, and massive retiree growth that is reshaping the country's economic landscape, especially as younger workers face affordability challenges in housing, childcare, education, and healthcare that delay family formation and push birth rates even lower. Entire regions of the United States, particularly the Midwest and parts of the Northeast, are already experiencing demographic contraction similar to early-stage Japan, with declining school enrollment, shrinking towns, aging populations, and tax bases that struggle to support growing long-term obligations. And even fast-growing states like Florida, Texas, and Arizona are seeing rapid increases in the share of elderly residents, creating new pressures on healthcare systems, infrastructure, and fiscal budgets. Social Security is projected to reach insolvency by the mid-2030s, Medicare by the early 2030s, and state pension systems across the country face funding gaps that collectively amount to trillions of dollars. And while political leaders from both parties promise solutions, the math is unforgiving. More retirees, fewer workers, higher costs, rising debt, and an economy increasingly reliant on financial engineering to sustain obligations that its demographic structure can no longer support at current levels. The national debt has exploded from $1 trillion in the early 1980s to more than $36 trillion today, with trillion-dollar deficits becoming routine even during periods of economic expansion. And for the first time in modern history, interest payments on the debt have surpassed the defense budget, consuming resources that once fueled innovation, infrastructure, and long-term investment. And the United States has increasingly turned to the same monetary tools Japan pioneered, including zero interest rates, quantitative easing, and large-scale government intervention in financial markets whenever volatility threatens stability. This monetary environment has inflated asset prices, fueled speculative booms, and created distortions that make the economy more dependent on continued low rates and government support. And although the U.S. remains far more dynamic and entrepreneurial than Japan in many ways, the structural forces shaping its long-term trajectory are moving in the same direction as Japan's demographic and fiscal path in the late 20th century, with the same underlying risks that growth will gradually slow, productivity gains will diminish, and the country will enter a prolonged period where expansion becomes harder and harder to achieve without unsustainable levels of stimulus. The United States is not Japan. But the mathematics of aging societies does not change across borders, cultures, or political systems, and already other advanced economies are experiencing similar demographic pressures that reinforce the idea that Japan was not an exception, but the first example of a much larger global shift. As South Korea now has the lowest fertility rate in the world, far below Japan's at its worst, and China is approaching demographic decline decades earlier than expected due to the lingering effects of the one-child policy, rapid urbanization, and rising living costs that discourage family formation, while Italy, Spain, and Germany all face shrinking populations, aging workforces, and rising pension burdens that echo the Japanese pattern. These countries demonstrate that demographic decline is not a uniquely Japanese issue, but a universal challenge for advanced societies where cultural, economic, and technological progress coincides with falling birth rates, rising longevity, and increasingly unsustainable fiscal structures built for younger populations. And as these trends strengthen across the developed world, the economic environment of the 21st century will be shaped by the same forces that defined Japan's stagnation, creating a future where slow growth, massive debt, aging societies, and perpetual stimulus become the norm rather than the exception. And this global context matters because the United States is entering this demographic era at a time when its obligations, institutions, and expectations were built for a younger nation. And the gap between what the country promises and what its demographic structure can support grows larger every year, forcing policymakers to choose between higher taxes, reduced benefits, larger deficits, or increasingly aggressive monetary intervention, all of which carry their own long-term risks. And as these pressures mount, more analysts are beginning to see the unmistakable resemblance between the United States today and Japan at the onset of its long stagnation period. The similarity does not lie in culture or in politics, but in something far more foundational: the ratio of workers to retirees, the trajectory of birth rates, the accumulation of debt relative to GDP, the slowing growth of productivity, and the increasing difficulty of generating real economic expansion without relying on financial engineering. And as the United States approaches the same ratio of retirees to workers that Japan experienced in the 1990s, the economic consequences become harder to ignore. A shrinking workforce means slower economic growth unless productivity can rise fast enough to compensate. But productivity gains in the United States have been slowing for years, despite the presence of world-leading technology companies. And many of the innovations that once accelerated productivity now primarily enhance convenience rather than output, meaning the economy's underlying engine is not being fundamentally transformed at the pace required to offset demographic drag. And this creates a long-term dilemma as the number of retirees grows faster than the number of workers needed to support them. The implications extend beyond economics into the social fabric of the nation, with younger generations carrying increasing financial burdens as they face higher taxes, rising healthcare costs, unaffordable housing, and greater pressure to support aging family members, creating a cycle where financial insecurity leads to delayed marriage and fewer children, which in turn accelerates demographic decline, reinforcing the very trend policymakers hope to slow. As this cycle deepens, it becomes increasingly difficult to reverse because demographic change is slow to respond to policy and can take decades to shift, even under the best circumstances. And unlike economic downturns or political crises, demographic decline does not create dramatic moments of recognition, but unfolds over long stretches of time, accumulating quietly until the consequences become too large to conceal. The United States already shows signs of the same silent pressures Japan's society felt in the early stages of decline. Schools consolidating due to lower enrollment, rural towns struggling to maintain services as populations shrink, states facing higher pension costs with fewer working-age taxpayers to fund them, and healthcare systems strained by an aging population that requires more long-term care than the system was designed to deliver. Meanwhile, the country's largest social safety programs are approaching financial tipping points that would require either significant tax increases, substantial benefit reductions, or unprecedented levels of government borrowing to maintain solvency. And each of these choices carries political and economic consequences that become more severe the longer reforms are delayed. Debt, once a temporary tool to stabilize the economy, has become a permanent fixture of U.S. fiscal policy. And the federal government's reliance on borrowing has grown so routine that trillion-dollar deficits are now treated as normal, even during periods of economic expansion, a pattern that mirrors Japan's steady accumulation of debt throughout the 1990s and 2000s, as it attempted to sustain living standards and economic activity despite a shrinking workforce and rising elderly population. The difference, of course, is that the United States issues the world's primary reserve currency and has a much larger, more flexible economy. But these advantages do not eliminate demographic and fiscal realities. They merely delay their impact, buying time at the cost of ever-increasing obligations that future generations will have to face. The worry among economists is not that the United States will face a sudden collapse, but that it will drift into a prolonged period of stagnation, similar to Japan's, characterized by slow growth, heavy debt, perpetual low interest rates, and a society increasingly shaped by the preferences and needs of an older population rather than the ambitions and energy of a younger one. And this shift in societal focus has profound implications for innovation, risk-taking, entrepreneurship, and the cultural dynamism that once defined the country's global influence. In aging societies, the appetite for risk diminishes as older citizens prioritize stability over change, preservation over disruption, and the protection of existing assets over investment in new ventures. And this risk aversion can spread into the political and economic systems, making it harder to implement bold reforms, encourage entrepreneurship, or support investments that pay off decades later when an older electorate tends to favor short-term benefits over long-term planning. At the same time, the rising costs of caring for an aging population consume a growing share of government budgets, crowding out spending on infrastructure, education, research, and other investments that contribute to long-term growth. And as these priorities shift, the economy becomes increasingly dependent on monetary intervention to maintain a sense of stability, creating feedback loops where financial markets rely on low interest rates. Low rates fuel asset inflation widens inequality, and inequality reduces the ability of younger generations to form families, further weakening demographic momentum. This cycle is not hypothetical. It is visible in multiple aging societies around the world, with Japan serving as the clearest example, but South Korea and China rapidly approaching similar conditions as their birth rates fall and their elderly populations surge. And the United States is gradually entering the same demographic zone, even as it tries to maintain the identity of a young, dynamic, fast-growing country. The real challenge is that unlike sudden crises, which create opportunities for sweeping reform, demographic decline unfolds so slowly that political leaders consistently postpone action, preferring to maintain the status quo rather than confront the difficult trade-offs required to adapt to the new demographic reality. And by the time the consequences become unmistakable, the options available have become narrower, the fiscal room has diminished, and the political will has weakened. Many Americans still believe the country is immune to the kind of stagnation Japan experienced, because the United States has historically been defined by immigration, innovation, and cultural reinvention. But even these strengths have limits when confronted with large-scale demographic shifts that reduce the number of young workers, increase dependency ratios, and strain public finances. And the belief that the United States is different can become a form of complacency that prevents necessary action when it is still possible to make a meaningful difference. The deeper danger is not economic collapse, but the slow fading of economic momentum, where growth becomes increasingly difficult to achieve, productivity increases flatten, wages stagnate, debt accumulates indefinitely, and political polarization intensifies as generations compete for shrinking resources and future expectations diverge sharply between younger and older Americans, creating societal tensions that can persist for decades. This slow decline is harder to diagnose and harder to rally against because it does not feel like a crisis. It feels like a gradual shift in the background, a soft drift toward a future where opportunities narrow, dynamism fades, and national ambition weakens. And by the time people realize what has changed, the process is already far advanced and difficult to reverse. Japan learned this slowly, painfully, and quietly, as each decade produced fewer signs of renewal and more signs of entrenchment. And while the country remains wealthy, stable, and technologically advanced, it is also trapped in a demographic and fiscal cycle that limits its ability to revive the explosive growth and transformative energy that once defined its post-war era. And the fear among economists observing the United States is not that it will become poor or unstable, but that it will enter a similar long-term plateau where innovation continues but growth stagnates, where wealth persists but opportunity narrows, and where dynamism endures only in isolated pockets rather than across the entire economy. The Japan trap is not a dramatic fall. It is the quiet acceptance of lower expectations, the normalization of slow growth, the gradual shift from future-oriented ambition to present-focused maintenance. And if the United States follows this path, it will not be because of a single event, but because of a long series of small decisions, delayed reforms, demographic shifts, and fiscal imbalances that accumulate over decades until the weight of the past becomes too heavy for the future to outrun. The question facing the United States is not whether demographic pressure will shape its future. It already is. But whether the country can adapt fast enough to prevent the demographic cycle from becoming destiny, and whether it can find new sources of growth, productivity, and societal energy that can counterbalance the aging of the population and the rising fiscal burden that comes with it. The experience of Japan shows that once a nation enters this demographic zone, escape becomes increasingly difficult, because the very forces that slow growth also reduce the ability to invest in the future, creating a feedback loop that slowly tightens over time. And unless the United States confronts this reality with clarity and urgency, it may find itself drifting into the same long-term stagnation that has shaped Japan's trajectory for more than 30 years. And yet the outcome is not predetermined, because demography sets the stage but does not write the entire script. And the United States still possesses advantages that Japan lacked, including greater geographic diversity, a stronger immigration pipeline, abundant natural resources, world-leading research universities, and a culture of innovation that has historically allowed it to reinvent itself every few decades. But these advantages can only matter if the country acknowledges the demographic shift early enough to act on it. Because ignoring the pattern is what allowed Japan's problems to take root so deeply that even extraordinary efforts could not restore the growth momentum it once enjoyed. But the difficulty for any society confronting demographic decline is that solutions require long-term thinking, sacrifice, and political courage at a time when older voters constitute a growing share of the electorate and tend to prioritize stability over disruption. preservation over investment, and short-term benefits over long-term reforms. And this creates a political mismatch between what is necessary and what is popular, making reform not only difficult, but often politically impossible. The Japan trap is not simply demographic decline. It is demographic decline combined with political paralysis, fiscal constraints, and an aging electorate incentivized to avoid change. And unless the United States can break this feedback loop, it will gradually be pulled into the same slow-growth future that reshaped Japan's economic destiny, not through crisis, but through decades of inaction. The way demographic decline shapes a society is rarely obvious in the moment, because people measure life through the stability of their routines, not through the shifting structure of the population. And it is only after many years that the effects become unmistakable, seen in the quiet struggles of younger generations, the rising costs of pensions and healthcare, the pressure on public budgets, the stagnation of wages, the decline in entrepreneurship, and the increasing difficulty of supporting both present needs and future investment. The United States is already beginning to experience these pressures as younger Americans face affordability barriers in housing, education, healthcare, and childcare that delay family formation and reduce birth rates, while older Americans draw on Social Security and Medicare programs that are growing faster than the economy itself, creating a fiscal imbalance that expands each year and pushes the government to rely more heavily on borrowing to fill the gap. One of the most subtle but dangerous aspects of this cycle is how it reshapes expectations. Because as slow growth becomes normal, people begin to adjust their hopes and ambitions downward, accepting wages that no longer rise meaningfully, housing that becomes harder to afford, and debt burdens that grow heavier with each generation. And these shifting expectations slowly erode the optimism and forward momentum that once defined American society. In Japan, this shift happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, as each new generation adapted to a world where economic expansion was no longer the default, and lifetime employment, stagnating wages, and limited upward mobility became the accepted reality of adult life. And while Japan remains a prosperous nation by global standards, its decline in dynamism is a cautionary tale about how even wealthy, stable societies can lose the spark that once drove innovation and expansion. The fear for the United States is not collapse, but a similar soft landing into long-term stagnation, where the country remains wealthy, but less dynamic, less bold, less willing to take risks, and less able to generate the broad-based growth that once supported its global leadership. And such a future would reshape not only economics, but culture, politics, and national identity. As societies age, their priorities shift towards safety, predictability, and resource protection, rather than expansion, exploration, and experimentation. And these priorities can alter the way countries approach everything from economic policy to foreign policy to domestic investment, reinforcing patterns that favor the status quo over bold transformation. And this is precisely the environment in which Japan became comfortable, stable, and stagnant. It is also the environment toward which the United States may be drifting without fully recognizing it, as political debates increasingly revolve around maintaining existing benefits rather than pursuing ambitious new investments, and as public discourse becomes more polarized around generational divides, where younger Americans struggle to build a future while older Americans prioritize the protection of past gains. The deeper danger is that demographic decline creates a cycle of political fragmentation, economic frustration, and cultural pessimism, where each generation feels increasingly disconnected from the others and unable to find common ground on the policies necessary to confront long-term challenges. And this fracturing can weaken a country's ability to act decisively at precisely the moment when decisive action is needed most. Japan avoided political instability because its culture strongly values consensus, social harmony, and continuity. But the United States is far more polarized, far more adversarial, and far more vulnerable to political gridlock, making its version of the demographic challenge potentially more volatile and more difficult to manage. And if the country enters a prolonged period of stagnation, the pressures could deepen economic divides, intensify cultural conflict, and produce a political environment where reform becomes even harder. Meanwhile, the rising cost of caring for an aging population will continue to absorb larger portions of the federal budget, crowding out investment in areas that once fueled American leadership, such as infrastructure, scientific research, space exploration, education, and technological development. And without these investments, the country will find it harder to maintain its edge in innovation and productivity, leading to a future where growth slows not because Americans lack talent or ambition, but because the demographic and fiscal environment no longer supports rapid expansion. The Japan trap is therefore not only a demographic problem. It is an economic, political, and cultural transformation that changes the core assumptions of a nation. And the United States stands at the threshold of this transformation now, facing choices that will determine whether it follows Japan into decades of stagnation or finds a way to reinvent itself once again and embrace a new kind of growth suitable for an aging world. The lesson of Japan is not that decline is inevitable, but that decline becomes inevitable when societies fail to adapt to demographic reality. And the United States can avoid this future only if it recognizes that the foundations of its economy are shifting, and that new policies, new investments, and new ways of thinking are required to sustain prosperity in a world where aging populations and rising debt are the defining forces of the century. But time is the one resource that cannot be replenished, and demographic momentum moves slowly but relentlessly. And every year that passes without meaningful action narrows the window of opportunity to avoid the long stagnation that defined Japan's experience. The United States still has the capacity to change its trajectory, but the question is whether it has the will, the clarity, and the unity to do so before the demographic forces shaping its future harden into a destiny that no amount of stimulus, borrowing, or political rhetoric can undo. In the end, the pattern that reshaped Japan did not strike suddenly. It unfolded quietly across years and decades until the cumulative pressure became too great to reverse. And if the United States does not confront that same pattern with urgency and honesty, it may find itself waking decades from now to a future that did not collapse suddenly, but instead slipped away little by little, exactly as it did in Japan.